Week 9, you're going to study urbanization. It was a hard call whether to have you look at urbanization or the next chapter, which goes over inside the city. Both of these are really important, but I thought because we're going to end up with an environmental focus on a global perspective, I wanted us to look at urbanization from that perspective as well. So they talk about the idea that historically we've had more rural than urban population, and just since 2008 is the first time the world has seen the majority of the population living in cities. And that number is about 4 times the population in 1950. So the expectation then is that by 2030, 60% of the world population will be living in urban centers. And this is going to be seen primarily in less developed countries. They're going to grow more rapidly, and that will come at a huge cost. So as we learned, more developed countries tend to be more industrialized, and so they have larger urban centers. And again, this growth in cities is coming from two functions. One is this migration from rural areas to urban areas, and then the other is that in general, some countries or some areas are having a high natural growth rate, which means the death rate is less than the birth rate, and that in some of these areas they have a higher total fertility rate. And so you're going to see that dynamic, particularly in less developed countries. The book talks about megacities, and this caused me a little bit of research because I was looking at megacities are defined as urban centers that have over a population of 10 million. And so if you look at the city population of Tokyo, it's not 34 million. However, if you look at the city of Tokyo and the neighboring cities and communities, kind of the entire region, then you do have high populations. And so the difference, like for example, the text has New York City as having 21 million, when the city of New York actually has 8 million people. But when you look at the surrounding urban areas, it's a real mega city and megalopolis there. And this has been pretty interesting in that when we in a little bit we'll talk about global cities, and for the first time the US and Europe are not in the higher rankings for global cities, that we've kind of dropped out, and I think one of the videos talks about that as well. The book also mentions the term primate city, and this is the idea that most people when they're migrating from rural areas are going to try and target a primate city. And the primate city, they're just not looking for any city. They're looking for a city that has some kind of dominant power within the country. Usually this is a city that has economic, political, and has some kind of draw, much more than just Portland would be much more of a primate city than Eugene. So they're just looking at that hierarchy of cities, and most people are moving in to primate cities. Let me go back up a second. I'm good. So according to the researcher, what we're seeing is the growth in urban areas is almost twice as fast in developing countries as it is in developed countries. Part of this is causing, this is causing dramatic problems with this huge growth. There's unemployment, there's a lack of housing, and then there's a lack of infrastructure, water, sewage, garbage. And so when people live on the fringes, you also get higher crime rates in some of these areas. So we have cities that have the least development, the least resources, experiencing the most growth, and therefore some of the bigger problems. The book then backs up a little bit and talks about the development of cities, this idea that cultural development or city development really sprang from historical agricultural surpluses. So when we all of a sudden had more food than we needed to eat, then we developed a stratified society, so that because we had extra food, somebody could sell that food. And if somebody's selling the food, then somebody needs to protect the land while other people are off selling. And so you can see that this development of different skill sets and different job focus that happened from this agricultural development. And the book has a really nice summary of that. There are lots of models and ideas of how urban lands developed. There's the hydraulic civilization idea that because we were able to irrigate, there was more surplus, then there was the beginning of mass production. Other researchers believe that religious factors were the primary cause of city development, that religious buildings and religious figures then would draw people to those spaces. And then there's another model that believes that political factors cause the development of cities, where this idea of a stratified society that ended up with hierarchical rulers and kingships then would cause people to settle and develop that settlement for the ruler and the king would have power and then begin to move out into other areas. So when we look, let me go back here, when we look at cultural hearths, we're looking at where the early agriculture was, and then where these settlements probably began in association with the agriculture. And so we can look at, I think there are, let me go back, I just lost my slide here. Scroll down here a little bit, one more slide, there we go. Urban hearths. So there are 6 identified hearths. I think everybody in elementary school, we learn about the Tigris and the Euphrates Valley, the cradle of civilization, and that's still considered by many to be one of the agricultural hearths and therefore one of the oldest urban settlements. The Nile River Valley was also an agricultural focus, as was Pakistan along the Indus River, China along the Yellow River, and then Middle America and the Andean highlands. So when we go back to this map, you can see these major hearths, or places where culture developed, as in Middle America, the Andean highlands, China, Pakistan, the Tigris and Euphrates, and the Nile. So it gives you all of those elements for the beginning of developed civilization. The book talks a little bit about diffusion, and the idea the author really talks about this sense of, do we think that the cultural idea of building a city was spontaneously erupted in all 6 of those hearths at the same time? And he said probably not. That the agricultural development happened because of climate change, and that may have been somewhat evolutionary, but the traits were more likely learned from diffusion. And this idea again of kingships and that expansion diffusion, where somebody starts to develop and conquer the land next to them, setting up posts to support trade and development. And so we look at that kind of expansion diffusion as a way to spread the ideas of settlements and cities. So we're back to kind of what's causing this rural to urban migration. And remember, it's rarely the pull of a new life that is the initiator for migration. Usually it's the push. And so current rural lives are very difficult. Often there are hunger, no jobs at all, sanitation issues, and so people are being pushed from that rural way of life. And then the second impact is the pull of these primate cities. And one of the things that happens is many of these new urban dwellers end up having very difficult lives because they're still living in poverty. They may be getting manufacturing jobs, but they're very low paying manufacturing jobs, and often the working conditions are we would, in the US, those would be illegal working conditions. So then there was a researcher who discusses the idea that he thinks that this large-scale migration can be originally related to colonization, that spurred the development of people moving into cities. So the book goes on to talk a little bit about this idea of global cities. So as we've developed globalization, then we have larger cities that have transnational or multinational companies, these major economic centers that have corporate headquarters, financial institutions, and this is where we begin to see the U.S. not being the dominant player that it was 10, 15 years ago. One of the things to think about in city development is this idea of site and situation, and this is a very common theme in geography when we're looking at the development of place. And I think we can't do that anymore without looking or thinking about the major impact of global climate change. So when we talk about site, we're talking about the local setting. So is it on a river? Is it coastal? Is it mountainous? And every site has advantages and disadvantages. So especially when we're looking at global climate change, so that we can think about Newport, Oregon as having a coastal site. And this is a great thing, and it got the NOAA National Oceanic and Atmospheric Center situated or located in Newport, and yet it's going to have disadvantages as we look at sea level rise and as we think about earthquake damages along the coast. Situation is the regional setting, and so that is related to the relationship that place has with the rest of the area. So San Francisco used to be a major port, and its situation was very instrumental in global transportation and in the U.S. That role has changed over time. If I go back to the example of Newport, Oregon, the situation it's a pretty small town in Oregon, and it's a pretty small coastal town, and it was in competition with a site in Washington that had a much more dominant situation, where there were higher tech companies, there was more infrastructure to support that. And so it was really interesting that Newport, Oregon was able to get the NOAA atmospheric site located there. So we can also look at urbanization in terms of the housing itself. Squatter settlements is a term that's used also. Barradas is another term used for squatter settlements, and these are often considered illegal housing. They're very, some people will call them slum households. The U.S. has a term for slum households that means a group that has access to water and sanitation and a little bit of security. And so that's almost a step up from a squatter settlement or a barradas. Apparently, about 1 billion people live in housing areas like this. And these are very temporary shelters in some ways. There are places in the world that will routinely bulldoze squatter settlements. Sometimes you'll see them with cardboard structures or plywood structures or pallets or tin. Often no water, no trash, no security in these settlements. And I think what was the the movie Slumdog Millionaire had some great images of squatter settlements. So I want you to really look at the terminology and be able to define that. But the videos have some very interesting ideas about urban areas and urbanization. I really want you to take a look at these videos, and I want you to be able to describe how urban areas develop. Why are they growing? Why do people go to cities? And then really be able to talk about shanty towns. You may need to do a little research. There's some great images with these videos that will talk about that. How are squatter settlements changing? How many people live in them today? What is the expected growth rate? And then one of the videos, I think it's the one by Newworth, he has some great examples of how these squatter cities can actually be developed into protected housing for people, and he talks about how that's happening in Turkey. And so they're just very fascinating videos, I think, this week. So take a look at those, and that will be the majority of your discussion will be around squatter cities and these videos. And then your last assignment for the term is you're going to do a little research using the CIA World Factbook to collect some data about urban and rural percentages, disease, the GDP in several countries. I think I've listed 4 or 5 countries on the worksheet that you're going to look at. And then when you've filled in the data collection sheet, I want you to pick one of the cities that I've listed on the assignment sheet and do some research about the specific squatter settlements in that particular city. Each of the cities has a different site and situation. Each of the cities has a different demographic and different political structure, and is experiencing different problems and solutions in that city. So I'm going to ask you to do a short 2 to 3 page report on that city and upload that this week. All right, so you're almost done, so hang in there.